Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 373 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the recent congressional hearings on the JFK assassination. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the episode. We'll have your feedback on our recent episode on animal end-of-life experiences. But first, in 1963, the nation and the world were shocked when American President John F. Kennedy was suddenly assassinated in Dallas, Texas. A suspect named Lee Harvey Oswald was quickly arrested, but he was himself assassinated while in police custody. The American government has looked at these events more than once and arrived at different conclusions. Many doubt the conclusions that different government groups reached, and many question the role of agencies like the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, and others. They believe that some or all of these agencies participated in a cover-up. Recently, a group of 6 witnesses testified before a committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, and some of them made explosive charges. So what did the witnesses say? What credibility do they have, and what really happened with the JFK assassination? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, what do we need to say to begin?
Well, we have a loose ongoing series of episodes on Mysterious World about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy back in 1963. The first episode we did on this was way back in episode 15 on the assassination itself. In that episode, I didn't give a final theory of who killed the president, but I said that none of the common positions are automatically crazy. The evidence is such that if you think Lee Harvey Oswald was framed by a conspiracy, you're not crazy. If you think he was part of a conspiracy, you're not crazy. And if you think he acted alone, you're not crazy. There is evidence that points in multiple directions. I therefore planned a series of follow-up episodes in which we looked at the different theories in more detail. Originally, I wanted to do one episode a year on the anniversary of the assassination in November, but that hadn't worked out, at least so far. However, we did do another discussion in episode 233 on Oswald's first reported assassination attempt, where he allegedly fired on General Edwin Walker, and we'll continue to do episodes on this subject. Earlier this year, President Trump fulfilled his promise to release the last of the JFK assassination files that the government had collected. He's also promised to release the files it's gathered on the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. As soon as the JFK files were released, people immediately wanted to know what I thought about them, but there were, going on 100,000 pages released, and there's no way I could process all that. So I've been waiting for people who devote their full-time efforts as researchers to process them, and I'll report on what they find in the future. My impression is that the newly released files add some data to what we previously knew and confirm some things that were suspected, but there's not anything that dramatically changes the picture. However, recently, the House Oversight and Governmental Reform Committee held hearings on the way the government and its agencies handled the JFK assassination, and I've watched those. They contained some very important eyewitness testimony, and so today we're going to be going through clips of the hearings, and I'll be commenting on them. I've studied the JFK assassination a great deal. I've read numerous books about it. So think of this episode as me guiding you through the recent hearings. You can imagine that you're at the hearings and I'm sitting next to you and letting you know the significance of what's being said based on my years of research. I should mention that today we will be dealing with an assassination, and so we'll be hearing some medical testimony about that, but they keep everything clinical and we will not be seeing any gruesome photographs.
Then, as a refresher, let's begin with an overview of the assassination itself and what happened afterwards. What should we know?
On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was paying a visit to the city of Dallas, Texas. At about 12:30 p.m., he was on his way to lunch and riding in a motorcade. The people of Dallas turned out to watch the motorcade and wave at him. The president's car had just passed the Texas School Book Depository building when suddenly shots rang out, and it was clear that the president was injured, as was Texas Governor John Connally, who was sitting in front of him. The president's car raced to nearby Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors desperately tried to save his life, but they failed. His injuries were too great. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was then sworn in as president, and the presidential party, along with the former president's body, returned to Washington.
How did the investigation into the assassination proceed?
The Dallas police soon arrested a young man named Lee Harvey Oswald. He was an employee of the Texas School Book Depository, but he denied shooting the president and said he was just a patsy. 2 days later, on Sunday the 24th, Oswald was being transferred from the Dallas City Jail to the county jail when he was fatally shot by a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. Ruby was then arrested and convicted of the murder of Oswald. Following these events, President Johnson impaneled a commission led by Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren. The Warren Commission then investigated the assassination and issued a report concluding that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone and was not part of a conspiracy. However, there were many criticisms of the Warren Commission's methodology and findings, and so in 1976, the U.S. House of Representatives instituted a committee to look into the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. This was known as the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or HSCA. In 1979, they released their report, which held that Oswald had been part of a conspiracy to kill the president. So at this point, we have two government inquiries that arrived at contradictory conclusions. The Warren Commission held that there was not a conspiracy, but the HSCA held that there was. In 1991, Oliver Stone released a movie about the assassination called JFK, and the furor it generated led to the passage in 1992 of the JFK Records Act, in which required the National Archives to collect records related to the JFK assassination. It also established an independent body known as the Assassinations Records Review Board, which was tasked with overseeing the declassification and release of the documents which had been gathered. The new law contained provisions, though, for withholding or redacting some records on grounds of national security, so not everything was released at once. The process of release was finally completed in March of 2025. However, there are allegations that some records have not been properly gathered and released as the law requires.
Is there anything else we should know before we look at the recent hearings?
I'll give additional information as we go through the clips, but there is one overarching thing which concerns the Warren Commission's eventual theory of how the assassination happened. According to this theory, Lee Harvey Oswald, alone, fired 3 shots at the president's motorcade. He fired all 3 shots from a window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, which was behind the president's limousine. So all 3 bullets came from behind, and no bullets came from the front or the side of the limousine. According to the first version of this theory, the first bullet struck President Kennedy in the back and exited through his throat. A second bullet struck Governor Connally, and a third bullet struck President Kennedy in the back of his head. However, it was then discovered that one of the bullets didn't hit anybody. Instead, it had missed and struck a concrete curb in front of the limousine. It chipped the concrete, and the chip struck and cut a bystander on the face. So there was physical evidence and an injured eyewitness that one bullet missed. That would suggest 4 bullets were fired, but whoever was in the school book depository only could have fired 3. So either there was a conspiracy or they needed a new theory. The new theory was proposed by Arlen Specter, who at the time was an attorney for the Warren Commission, and he later became a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. Specter proposed that there were only 3 bullets. 1 struck the curb in front of the motorcade, 1 struck the president in the back, exited through his throat, and then proceeded forward and injured Governor Connally, and the third one hit the president in the back of the head.
That sounds plausible. What's the problem with that?
Well, here's where people disagree. According to this theory, Kennedy and Connally were both hit by the same bullet, and so this is sometimes called the single bullet theory. But some have argued that the bullet would have had to do some amazing, implausible twists and turns to injure them both in the places where they were hit. So it's also called the magic bullet theory. You'll hear both terms used. Fans of the Warren Commission theory tend to call it the single bullet theory, and skeptics of the Warren Commission tend to call it the magic bullet theory. There's no doubt that President Kennedy was struck in the back, and there's no doubt that Governor Connally was also struck in the back. But the bullet that struck Governor Connally then exited through his chest, hit his wrist and injured it, and then it exited his wrist and hit his leg. This much is agreed upon by supporters and skeptics of the Warren Commission, but it's argued by skeptics that there are implausibilities connected with what this bullet did. The first implausibility, they say, is that the bullet hit President Kennedy in the back. It then turned upwards and exited through his throat, which is not impossible if it bounced off a bone or something. But then upon exit in the throat, it turned downward for no reason to hit Governor Connally in the back, whereas it should have kept going upward if it had bounced off a bone. The second implausibility, according to some, is that it not only needed to turn down for no reason, it also needed to swerve right and then left again to hit the governor in the right place. The third implausibility is that a bullet that hit President Kennedy bounced off a bone, then hit Governor Connally, went through his wrist where it also hit a bone, and ended up in his leg should be pretty beaten up. Yet the bullet that was recovered is perfectly intact. It doesn't show any of the kind of wear and tear that it ought to after causing so many wounds. Now, fans of the Warren Commission propose answers to these claims. For example, they've argued that the second implausibility is an illusion, that Governor Connally's body was simply turned, so the bullet didn't need to swerve right and left to hit him in the correct place. It just continued on a straight path. But these are some of the kinds of debates that are held.
Okay, then with that as background, let's look at the recent government hearings. Who was involved in them?
Well, the hearings were led by Chairwoman Anna Paulina Luna, who's a Republican representative from Florida. The ranking member of the committee who was present was Robert Garcia, who is a Democratic representative from California. Questions were also asked of the witnesses by several committee members. When it comes to the witnesses themselves, there were 6 of them. Abraham Bolden, who was a former Secret Service agent who had guarded President Kennedy, Dr. Don Curtis, a doctor at Parkland Memorial Hospital who treated the president, Dan Hardway, a former investigator for the 1970s House Assassinations Committee, Judge John Tunheim, former head of the 1990s Assassinations Records Review Board, Mr. Douglas Horn, a former staffer of the Assassinations Records Review Board, and Miss Alexis Coe, a presidential historian. And by the way, I should point out that before they gave any testimony, all 6 of the witnesses were sworn to tell the truth, so they are subject to the penalty of perjury if they lied about anything.
How do you want to go through their testimony?
Well, what I'm interested in is what we can learn about the assassination itself and what the government and its agencies did afterwards. So I'm going to be discarding information that doesn't help us do that. Basically, I want to go through the witnesses in reverse chronological order, starting with the witnesses who offered testimony concerning the most recent things and working our way back to the witnesses who offered testimony concerning the earliest things. So we'll work our way back to the day of the Kennedy assassination itself. We'll start with Ms. Coe, the historian whose testimony concerns the most recent things. Then we'll look at the 2 members of the Assassination Records Review Board from the 1990s. That would be Judge Tunheim and Douglas Horn. Then we'll move to the investigator for the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s. That's Dan Hardway. And finally, we'll hear from 2 individuals who were active at the time of the assassination. The first is former Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden, who knew Kennedy before the assassination, though his testimony primarily concerns things that happened afterwards. And the second is Dr. Don Curtis, who was one of the physicians in attendance on President Kennedy at Parkland Memorial Hospital immediately after the assassination occurred.
Then let's begin with Ms. Coe. What does she have to say?
Unfortunately, not a lot that's relevant to what we're interested in today, because all of her testimony was connected with recent events. She had been called as a witness by the Democratic members of the committee. Her statement was quite political, and she largely expressed criticisms that concerned recent matters. For example, she criticized the way President Trump recently released the records, such as the fact that they included the Social Security number of at least one living person. And I think that's a fair criticism. Apparently, President Trump thought that all the people whose Social Security numbers were in the remaining records were deceased. And he didn't realize that anyone was still alive, so he just said, release it all, let the public see everything, which is a praiseworthy intent, even if it wasn't executed as well as it should have been. Ms. Coe also criticized her fellow witnesses and the committee itself, arguing that they were phrasing things in an overly dramatic way that was suggestive of conspiracy and cover-up, and I think that's a fair caution to express. We always want to check how things are being phrased and consider, other ways of looking at situations. That's part of what we do here on Mysterious World. So I'm not going to be assuming anything that's not supported by the evidence. Unfortunately, Ms. Coe did not offer any evidence to rebut what her fellow witnesses said, and I went back and watched her testimony more than once to make sure that I hadn't missed anything. So I think while she made some good points, she didn't say anything that tells us about what happened in the history of these events, either about the Kennedy assassination itself or about how the government and its agencies reacted in its aftermath, only about recent policy and perceptions.
Having heard from Ms. Coe, who was called as a witness by the Democrats on the committee, I know there was also something you wanted to say about the role of the two political parties in these hearings. What was that?
One of the things I was struck by, as you'll hear in the clips going forward, is that a large majority of the questions came from Republican representatives rather than Democrats. Now, they make an effort in committees like this to let anyone who wants time to ask questions to ask it and to balance the time between the two parties as they're represented on the committee. And right now, the House is pretty evenly divided, so this committee has approximately equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans on it. So the fact that it's overwhelmingly Republicans asking questions struck me as odd. You can tell from the video that the full committee was not present for these hearings. It appears that it was primarily Republicans who showed up, and very few Democrats did, which is odd because John F. Kennedy was a Democratic president, and I'd think that the Democrats would be at least as curious about his assassination and what government agencies did afterwards as Republicans would be. In fact, Democrats have historically been more suspicious of government agencies than Republicans. I'm curious as anybody about why so many Democrats didn't show up for these hearings, but I prefer not to speculate about that. I just wanted to let you know that I was struck by the fact that the questioning was so one-sided in terms of political parties, and that they do make an effort to provide balance between the parties, assuming that members of both parties show up and request time to ask questions. So I'll leave the reason for the disparity to the listeners.
Then let's look at the testimony of Judge John Tunheim, who was the chair of the 1990s Assassinations Records Review Board. What did he have to say?
He initially described how he came to be on the ARRB and how its work proceeded. He also discussed recommendations it made on how to avoid the problems of government overclassification of documents, which he believes happened in this case. In other words, he believes that material was classified and withheld from the public that should not have been classified, which is a frequent charge that I find extremely credible, not just in this case, but in general. He also testified about what happened with the records related to the assassination. This first clip is over 4 minutes long, but it's interesting. Judge Tunheim said,
Agencies largely complied with the mandate to present records to the review board. However, there were many delays and denials with records that we specifically requested, and there were many skirmishes along the way. It does not take a rocket scientist to realize that agencies were awaiting the end of our 3-year mandate. The first 500 or so adverse disclosure decisions we made in FBI records were appealed to the president, and the appeals were dropped when White House counsel, former judge, and Representative Abner Mikva told the FBI to drop the appeals because President Clinton would deny all of them. FBI staff was helpful to us, but I'm now seeing records in the new releases that were not disclosed to the review board. The CIA was cooperative and processed many documents with us, but we never received much of what we specifically asked for. When asked, for example, for documents involving James Angleton that we had not seen, I was told the documents were no longer maintained as a collection. We received only 3 memoranda that incorporated the agency's review of Angleton's counterintelligence files, not the files themselves, just a review by someone else of the files. We were told that all the other documents had been destroyed. I'm now seeing a flood of documents that clearly meet the definition of assassination records involving Angleton and others that were not submitted to us for review. When CIA analysts would not tell us the details of their secret operations, our response was, okay, we'll release the record in 10 days. We then heard the details and could make a reasonable decision. We had in our hands a small file on George Joannides that disclosed nothing really, so it was returned. We didn't know the details of his work at the time. We now know much more about Joannides, and his files should be immediately disclosed. There's no reason anymore for protecting those files. Clearly, we were misled. I actually wrote to President Biden asking that he order the CIA to release the Joannides file, and I never received a response. The Secret Service was very difficult. They were the only agency that we were aware of that tried to reclassify assassination records after we were in office. They attempted to classify documents that had already been released publicly and fought us over 1963 threat sheets that was still in process when we left office. The Department of State was less than helpful, although they released records in their possession. When we negotiated with Russian officials over the Oswald files in Moscow, they did not lift a finger to help us, not even allowing us access to the United States Embassy. When we tried to get access to Belarusian records on Oswald, they did not help. When we planned meetings with Mexican and Cuban officials, they stopped us from direct contacts. The act specifically required the Department of State to help us find foreign records. The National Archives was very helpful to us when we did our work. A very dedicated staff member, Stephen Tilley, was instrumental in getting our work done. But since we left office, I've been disappointed the Archives has not devoted more personnel to the records. We had planned that the Archives would continue our work to the extent possible. For the most part, that has not happened, and the agency has never been in contact with me. So there are other files that should be released. We came close to an agreement to copy the entire KGB file on Lee Harvey Oswald that is maintained in Minsk, Belarus. Last-minute disputes prevented the agreement from moving forward. Copies of the files are in Moscow. We were particularly interested in the files of Walter Sheridan, an investigator for Robert Kennedy. When we took office, he removed the files from the Kennedy Library where we had access to them and gave them to NBC for safekeeping. I don't think those files have been released. The William Manchester taped interviews of Jacqueline and Robert Kennedy are protected by a 1967 legal agreement, now controlled by Caroline Kennedy. We encouraged her to release the files, and she finally responded in August 1998 that she would not agree to their release or even let us listen to the recordings. And out there somewhere are files on Jack Ruby. We could not find them other than the files maintained by the earlier investigations.
So the bottom line, according to Judge Tunheim, is that there are still a bunch of files out there that have not been released. He also described how various agencies resisted the review board's efforts. There were delays in handing over what they requested. There were denials of things they requested, and there were refusals to help them get things they requested. He says that some files that should have been submitted to them were not, and that they were misled by some agencies. In particular, he cites the CIA, the Secret Service, and the Department of State as acting in bad faith. He says that there are files on Oswald in the former Soviet Union that could be obtained, but that haven't been due to lack of help from the proper agency, and that there are files on Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, that were never obtained. He also mentions 2 CIA individuals whose names may not be familiar to the listeners. One is James Jesus Angleton, who was the chief of the CIA's counterintelligence department, and the other is George Joannides, who was the CIA officer in charge of the psychological warfare branch of a covert operations office in Miami. Both of these individuals have reported ties to the JFK assassination, but the review board was unable to obtain files on them. One of the committee members, Andy Biggs, Republican of Arizona, also asked Judge Tunheim a question. He actually put this question to multiple witnesses, but the question was why the government's agency's response to the Kennedy assassination unfolded the way it did, because he sees this as having caused many Americans to come to distrust the government. Judge Tunheim replied,
Judge Tunheim.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question you pose as to why. I mean, I think that clearly, if you look at the history of all of this, there were cover-ups by both the FBI and the CIA, perhaps other organizations, in part because they had a lot of contact with Oswald in advance of the assassination, and there's no evidence that they alerted the Secret Service to the erratic behavior of Oswald. Oswald was in New Orleans. There was CIA contact with him then when he was a volunteer for this Fair Play for Cuba committee. I mean, they knew all about his visit to Mexico City. Both the FBI and the CIA knew about it. The FBI was following him in Dallas because he was a suspect in another shooting. All of this suggests that they had a lot of contact with him ahead of time, and I don't know what that suggests other than the fact that they wanted to cover that up, the fact that they knew a lot about him ahead of time and didn't do much about it.
So Judge Tunheim is convinced that the FBI and the CIA did execute a cover-up. Both agencies had knowledge of or contact with Oswald before the assassination. The CIA was aware of him when he was participating in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was an activist organization that supported Fidel Castro. Oswald also made a mysterious trip to Mexico City, and they were aware of him then. And the FBI had been following him because of suspicion he was involved in the assassination attempt on General Walker, which we talked about in episode 233. Some have argued that Oswald was himself an intelligence agent, but even if he wasn't, the CIA and the FBI knew about him and had contact with him, but they didn't warn the Secret Service about him posing a danger to the president. And once the president was killed, they wouldn't want to admit this, so they executed a cover-up for at least that reason. Ranking Member Garcia also asked Judge Tunheim a question.
Judge Tunheim, I just also want to ask you, just similar to what I asked Ms. Coe, do you think that this release of the records that just happened has added any substantial new information to what we already know?
You know, I think any release of records gives you more color, more pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. And I think this has been very interesting. I haven't had a chance to look through a lot of the materials, but a lot of the materials that have redactions in were materials we never saw. So they weren't shown to us before. So I think that is significant that there are documents being released there. I don't see any answers, any new answers to any of the old questions here, but it's filling out the record more. And I'd like to see a time when everything has been released, unredacted. It's 60-some years since the assassination. The assassination was closer to World War I than we are to the assassination. Let's release the materials, and that's my plea here, is just get everything out, let people decide what they want.
Finally, Chairwoman Luna asked him a question.
My first question goes to Judge Tunheim. Why did you tell President Biden that the CIA had deliberately misled your board about the Joanides file?
I did that because the CIA misled us. I mean, we had asked, we were picking up names all along, and people were telling us about other people to ask about. And we've been after the Joanides file for a while, and what we got was something very small. It looked like just a personnel file, what he got paid and, when he separated and that sort of thing. And the staff looked at it and thought it wasn't significant and sent it back. In retrospect, we shouldn't have done that. We should have asked for more. But they were told that the staff was told that was all they had on Joanides, which is clearly incorrect. So that's why I'd said that we had been deliberately misled by the CIA as to the nature of the Joanides files that were there. And I think those files likely are still there and can be released and should be released.
Yeah, I'd like to actually know for the public that's tuning in that we have been in talks with Director Radcliffe, and although he's been supportive, there has, in my opinion, been an orchestrated effort previously to hide this information. And so they're, while actively searching for it, also having issues locating it. So we are trying on our end, but you are correct, sir, in that observation. And I thank you for being here today to testify to that.
To add a little background on this, George Joannides had been a CIA agent in Miami, Florida in 1963, and he was in contact with an organization of Cuban exiles that had contact with Oswald in the months before the assassination. It's been proposed that Joannides was involved in a CIA operation to link Oswald to the Cuban government in a way that had plausible deniability. Then, in 1978, the CIA had Joannides serve as its liaison to the House Assassinations Committee, even though they assured the House that Joannides had not had involvement with any of this before, and they withheld this information from Congress. Consequently, people have been trying to get the CIA files on Joannides to find out what he did and didn't do. But the CIA has been saying, hey, we'd like to help you out, but we're having trouble finding those records, and making similar excuses. So we'll see what they finally come up with, if anything.
In addition to Judge Tunheim, the committee also heard from another individual from the 1990s Assassination Records Review Board. This was a staffer named Douglas Horn. What did he testify?
He described his involvement in the review board. This included taking depositions from the doctors involved in doing the autopsy on President Kennedy at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, once the president's body was flown back to Washington, and also the physicians at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. He'd also described the work that he subsequently done on the assassination, and as part of his opening statement, this is another clip that's over 4 minutes long, but it's also very interesting. He said,
"Many Americans remain troubled today by the many conflicts within the JFK medical evidence and what they might mean. And they remain unsatisfied with the official conclusions offered up by both the Warren Commission in 1964 and the HSCA Forensic Pathology Panel in 1979. Based on my work as an analyst at the ARRB and as an independent researcher, I have concluded that there are ample reasons for the disquiet of so many of the American people, to wit, first, 8 different sets of photographs known with confidence to have been taken during the autopsy on JFK are not in the official collection today and never have been. Some autopsy photos in the official collection at the National Archives are in gross disagreement with the head and neck wounds universally observed on November 22, 1963 by the treating physicians at Parkland Hospital, which they recorded in precise detail in their treatment notes that day and in their subsequent 1964 testimony. At least 2 and possibly 3 JFK skull x-rays exposed at Bethesda Naval Hospital are missing today and have never been in the official collection. The science of optical densitometry reveals that all 3 surviving skull x-rays are not originals, but rather are altered copy films. 2 highly qualified and respected MDs who were granted repeated access by the Kennedy family to the autopsy photographs and x-rays in the deed of gift collection at the archives both agree that the extant JFK skull x-rays reveal unambiguous and clear evidence of 2 headshots fired from in front of the president, contrary to the findings of the Warren Commission and the HSCA. The JFK skull x-rays actually reveal a total of 3 headshots, 1 from behind and 2 from the front. The so-called Harper fragment of skull bone, a crucial item of evidence signed for by the president's military physician and photographed and x-rayed by the FBI, has been missing since late in 1963. Many bullet fragments known to have been removed from President Kennedy's body at Bethesda Naval Hospital were never placed into the official record and are missing today. The remains of President Kennedy's brain following its examination were placed in a stainless steel container in 1963, but the brain is missing today, as many people know already. That stainless steel container and an original signed autopsy report were among materials transferred from the Secret Service to Senator Robert F. Kennedy in April of 1965. Those materials and others were not among the materials returned to the U.S. government by RFK on October 31st, 1966, via a deed of gift to the National Archives. The Kennedy family attorney, Burke Marshall, told the HSCA that Robert F. Kennedy had made those materials permanently inaccessible without providing details. The 14 brain photographs in the National Archives today cannot be and are not photographs of John F. Kennedy's brain. They have been impugned by the official photographer at the brain examination and by one of the FBI agents present at JFK's autopsy. The chain of custody of President Kennedy's body prior to the start of the autopsy, shortly after 8 p.m. on November 22, 1963, clearly appears to have been broken, casting even more doubt upon the reliability of the official autopsy report. And finally, Navy pathologists arrived at 4 sets of differing conclusions about President Kennedy's wounds and how he died within the 2 weeks after his death. The official autopsy report that is now in the National Archives represents only the 4th and final set of conclusions. This fact, perhaps more than any of the others above, is patently unacceptable in the nation that prides itself as the world's greatest democracy.
So there's a lot there, but the bottom line is that he says many photographs from President Kennedy's autopsy are missing or they have been altered. From the skull photos that we still have, 2 experts have determined that they contain evidence of the president having been struck in the head twice. Horn says that there's also evidence of a 3rd headshot, but the Warren Commission said there was only 1 headshot. So these findings would contradict the Warren Commission's account of the bullets and imply a second shooter. In addition, he says that key pieces of physical evidence are missing, including a bone fragment, fragments of bullets, and the president's brain. And he says that the chain of custody on the president's body was broken, meaning that his body was unaccounted for a period of time, which we'll hear more about. He then says,
the existing deed of gift, dated October 29, 1966, that sets severe restrictions upon who can view the JFK autopsy materials and how they can be used, needs to be re-examined and lifted. It has resulted in de facto suppression of these materials. Only by having free and unlimited access to the autopsy photographs and skull x-rays can troubling and persistent questions about their authenticity be definitively and finally resolved by qualified experts.
And he concludes by saying this.
In my concluding paragraph, I wish to make a short statement about the Zapruder film of the assassination. Studies in Hollywood of the individual film frames, that is, state-of-the-art digital scans of extremely high resolution, appear to show the use of visual effects, that is, animation or artwork, to crudely and blatantly alter the image content in some key frames. To state the problem simply, the digitized Zapruder film, studied by professionals in Hollywood, does not show the massive exit wound in the rear of the head seen at Parkland Hospital and by many witnesses at Bethesda during the autopsy, because it has been blacked out. And yet the film does appear to show head wounds not seen at Parkland Hospital. We now know that rather than spending the entire weekend following the assassination in Chicago at the Life printing plant, as was originally claimed, the Zapruder film actually spent most of the weekend in the custody of the CIA in Washington, D.C., and at Kodak's main research and development laboratory in Rochester, New York. The attitude of one National Archives official, expressed in writing circa 2009, was that they, quote, do not ever intend to take the film out of the freezer again, end quote. This decision This decision should be overturned, and the so-called purported original film should be made available for appropriate inspection by qualified film professionals from the motion picture industry and academia, and by that I mean film schools, so that questions of authenticity can be definitively resolved. I've provided many additional details in my written testimony, and I request that they be included in the congressional record. Thank you very much.
This contains a very explosive charge, if true. The Zapruder film was a home movie that businessman Abraham Zapruder happened to be taken of the motorcade when the assassination occurred. Many listeners will have seen it, but we won't be playing it today. It's not the only photographic evidence we have of the assassination, but it is the best. And here, Mr. Horn is saying that it's been altered. Now, I want to point out that in his opening statement, Mr. Horn is not simply presenting things that he knows because of his work on the Assassination Records Review Board. He's also summarizing things he's concluded due to his later work as an independent researcher, and he's dependent on what various experts have told him. So it doesn't represent personal knowledge of his. As a result, he could be wrong about many of these claims. I don't know that he's wrong, but I want to alert listeners that they need to thoughtfully consider what he has to say, not simply embrace it as if it's all true, because what a witness believes to be true and what is actually true are two different things.
What happened when the committee members got to ask questions of Mr. Horn?
First, here's Mr. Horn's response to Representative Biggs's question about why the government agencies handled the matter in a way that undermined public trust.
Those things would not have happened if a lone nut had killed the president. If a lone nut killed the president, there's no reason to do all those things, to destroy x-rays, to possibly alter autopsy photos, although that's not yet been determined. It's a question that remains outstanding, to alter the existing skull x-rays. So you don't do those things, and you don't change the autopsy conclusions 4 different times within 2 weeks after the president's death if a lone nut killed the president. So it's clear to me that the government, these are my conclusions after years of study, it's clear to me that the government was trying to manage what story it could sell to the American people. That's what was going on. And that's why the autopsy conclusions changed 4 times in the first 2 weeks.
Horn thus says that based on the conclusions he's drawn as an independent researcher, you wouldn't do the things he's alleging if the president had been killed by a lone nut. In other words, if the Warren Commission's theory is true. Instead, you'd only cover up these things if the medical evidence contained proof that the president was not killed by a lone gunman. Chairwoman Luna also asked this question.
To your knowledge, did even the Dallas Police Department or the FBI subject Lee Harvey Oswald to a paraffin test to determine whether he had fired the gun on November 22nd, 1963?
I'm going from memory, but I believe the FBI did, and he tested negative for firing a rifle. With
So
the paraffin test on his face shows he did not fire a bolt-action rifle, especially not a lousy rifle like the Mannlicher Carcano, which was an 1894 design or something.
So Oswald reportedly did not have rifle combustion products on his cheek according to the paraffin test, which he should have if he had fired a rifle on the day of the assassination. Chairwoman Luna then asked this.
What is the status of the record interview the author William Manchester conducted with Jacqueline Kennedy?
Well, my understanding is that, first of all, the Kennedy family liked William Manchester initially because he had written a campaign book in 1960 about the campaign. So they said, okay, why don't you write the book about the death of Jack, about the death of President Kennedy. When the book was reviewed by Jacqueline and Robert F. Kennedy, apparently Robert F. Kennedy had many objections. And so the Kennedy family sued Mr. Manchester when the books were in galley form. And they required that he take out certain portions of the text. So the lawsuit, what the lawsuit did was it said, the portions of the text that you removed will be sequestered until 2067, and the interviews you did with Jacqueline Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy will be sequestered withheld until 2067. So that was the result of that lawsuit. And so what we read today when we read Manchester's book is a sanitized or redacted version of his book, and we won't know what was removed until 2067. That's just very unfortunate, and I know Chairman Tunheim really made an effort to get Caroline Kennedy to agree to lift that court seal, and she didn't want to.
So the book manuscript that the Kennedy family commissioned has been expurgated, and we may not know what the expurgated parts of it said until 2067. That book is called The Death of a President. Now, I think that Jackie Kennedy's views are an important part of the historical record, but my suspicion is that they're likely not going to be anything evidentially explosive in the book. There are lots of reasons why political figures might want material cut. Wikipedia reports,
both Jacqueline and Robert F. Kennedy had refused to read the manuscript, delegating the review to former Kennedy administration members John Siegenthaler, Ed Guthman, and Richard N. Goodwin. They believed that passages in the book unflattering to Lyndon Johnson might damage Robert Kennedy's political plans for 1968 and requested changes. Pam Turnor, Jacqueline Kennedy's secretary, also read the manuscript, alarmed by many personal revelations from Jacqueline's interviews with Manchester, such as the fact that she smoked cigarettes, something Jacqueline Kennedy had hidden in the White House. She also provided lists of changes. Additionally, Jacqueline Kennedy believed that the proceeds from the Look offer should go to the Kennedy Library. She claimed that her interviews with Manchester had been intended for the library, threatened to block publication of the book unless the changes were made, unsuccessfully offered Look $1 million to cancel the serialization, and during late 1966, filed a lawsuit asking the court to issue an injunction to stop the book's publication. Newspaper articles about her decision speculated on the contents of the book. Through an out-of-court settlement during January 1967, Manchester agreed to delete 1,600 words from the serialization and 7 out of 654 pages from the published book. Although headlines noted Jacqueline Kennedy as the victor, Manchester claimed that the deletions were harmless and retained the serialization fee.
So the deletions may not have contained anything relevant to the assassination, and even if they did, they would just be Jackie Kennedy's personal views on matters, and so they'd be unlikely to be the kind of evidence that we could use to definitively resolve the mystery. Chairwoman Luna also asked which photos from the JFK autopsy are currently missing. Horn's response is a bit more than 5 minutes long, and to appreciate Horn's answer, you need to know that one of the disputes involves how President Kennedy was struck in the head, whether it was from the front or behind. The way bullet wounds work, you'd expect the entrance wound to be small, and if there's an exit wound, you'd expect it to be large, because bullets expand and get flattened out as they go through material, and especially if they hit hard material like bone. According to the single bullet theory, President Kennedy was struck from behind by the third bullet, which is not the second magic bullet that allegedly hit both him and Governor Connally in the back. You'd therefore expect a small entry wound in the back of his head and a large entry wound in the front of his head. But the claim is that the original autopsy photos showed the reverse. There was a small entry wound high on his forehead and a large exit wound on the back of his head. This would imply that President Kennedy was hit from a gunman firing in front of the motorcade, and that would imply a second gunman besides the one in the Texas School Book Depository behind the motorcade. It would thus suggest a conspiracy and not just a lone nut as the shooter. Now, here's what Mr. Horn says about the missing photos.
I mentioned 8 sets that I know with confidence from studying the evidence as an analyst are missing. First, an overhead wide shot of JFK's body taken from a stepladder, taken by John Stringer, the Navy photographer. He testified under oath to that. Second, a large bruise atop the right lung, taken from inside the interior of the chest after the lungs were removed. So this is a large blood clot up above where the apical portion of the lung was. And that's been testified to by both Dr. Humes and Stringer that they took those photographs, so they're not in the record. Third, an entrance wound in the lower right of the skull with the scalp reflected taken from outside the skull. And next, that same entrance wound in the lower right of the skull with the photo taken from inside the cranium after the brain was removed. So what's at issue with these two photos being missing is they would have determined definitively where was the entrance wound in the back of the head.
Would have been one of the Harper
No.
separate?
No, separate issue.
Okay.
The condition of the back of the, here's another missing photo. The condition of the back of the head after embalming and reconstruction was completed, which still showed an exit defect that could not be closed. The witness that claimed that was Sandra Spencer, a Navy photographer's mate who our general counsel, Jeremy Gunn, considered our most reliable medical witness. And so what she did was she developed color negatives and then prints of the president's body, postmortem photographs, but she said, when we deposed her, she said, oh, these pictures in the archives are horrible. We see open body cavities and a lot of blood, and the president looks really bad. She said, the photographs that I developed, he had been cleaned up, the head had been reconstructed, but there was still a hole in the back of his head even after the head was reconstructed.
So you have witness testimony that the archives photos do not reflect what?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, she testified under oath to that fact. Another missing photograph is a series, is that Robert Knudsen was a White House social photographer. He was involved with developing photography the weekend after the assassination by the president's military physician, Dr. Berkeley. So Knudsen testified to the HSCA that I developed a black and white film pack, negatives, black and white negatives, showing numerous probes in the president's body. And of course, probes are important because they determine bullet tracks. Where do bullets go in? Where do they come out, if they come out? And he remembered developing them and holding them up to the light in the darkroom after they were developed. And he remembered seeing probes in the body in this black and white film pack. And in the official autopsy collection, there was no black and white film pack used in photographs of the body. They're 4 by 5 inch duplex film. They're not black and white film packs. And there are no photographs of probes in the body in the official collection. And one of the people we interviewed was Dr. Carney, who was a resident at Bethesda. And when we told him, Jeremy Gunn and I, when we told him that there were no photographs of probes in the body in the official autopsy photo collection, he became visibly agitated and his face turned bright pink. And he said, I came in and out of the morgue many times as the resident on duty that night, but I saw flashbulbs going off when there were probes in the body. And you're telling me there's no photos in the collection? We said, that's right. So 2 more that are missing, and that concludes my answer. Black and white prints were seen by numerous people showing a large exit defect in the rear of JFK's head. So Mr. Knudsen, the White House photographer, Navy Chief Knudsen, showed such photos to another White House photographer, Joe O'Donnell, the week after the president died. Black and white prints showing a big exit wound in the back of the head. There are no such photos in the collection, but Joe O'Donnell said there were, and another witness that saw those photos was Navy Corpsman Dennis David. And he was shown those photographs by the Bethesda Naval Hospital audiovisual department head, Lieutenant Commander Pitzer. The last type of photo that's missing, black and white prints of an entry wound high in the forehead, up here. Not in the temple, but high in the forehead, above the right eye. Black and white prints showing that were shown by Mr. Knudsen, by Chief Knudsen to Mr. O'Donnell. They were also seen by Dennis David when Lieutenant Commander Pitzer showed him autopsy photographs. And a third witness surfaced in the year 2010, Quentin Schwen, who lives in Cleveland, and he, during a federal job interview, believe it or not, during a federal job interview with an intelligence agency, when he was at the Rochester Institute of Technology, majoring in photography, he was shown a color-positive transparency showing an entry wound high in the forehead of JFK. So that's my kind of lengthy answer on which photographs am I confident are missing.
The disappearance of the photos when they had probes, or basically sticks or rods, in the president's body is particularly significant because these would reveal the angles at which he was struck by the bullets and the angles by which they exited. Chairwoman Luna also asked about the chain of custody with the president's body, and Mr. Horn replied,
What is the evidence that you refer to about an interruption of chain of custody of President Kennedy's body prior to the start of the autopsy shortly after 8 p.m.?
Right. Yeah, because of this venue and this format, I'll have to give you a streamlined answer. I'm sure everyone will appreciate that. We know for a fact that the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base with a bronze Dallas casket in it arrived in front of Bethesda at 6:55 p.m. Remember that time. That's documented by the Secret Service report of Agent Clint Hill and by newspaper reporters. But the review board obtained an extremely important document written by a Marine Corps non-commissioned officer, Sergeant Boyjan of the United States Marine Corps. He led a team of Marines from the Marine barracks in Washington, D.C., to provide physical security at the autopsy. This was not the honor guard in dress uniforms. These were Marines from the Marine barracks to provide physical security. He wrote a report of what happened that night, and he wrote in his report dated November 26, 1963, he wrote that, and he's only talking about what happened with the president because that was his job, was to guard the president's body during the autopsy. He wrote that the casket arrived at 1835 hours. 1835 hours. That's 6:35 p.m., 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews arrived. And there is a considerable amount of evidence, a wide range of evidence, that the president's body really arrived by helicopter before the motorcade from Andrews. That's the broken chain of custody. And the issue here, it's a very important issue. The issue here is, if Sergeant Boyjan's report is correct, and he authenticated that to the review board staff, he authenticated that to me with a written letter and with a telephone interview. If his report is correct, then what was happening with the president's body between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock when the autopsy of record started? That's almost an hour and a half.
So according to Mr. Horn, we have evidence that the president's body was unaccounted for an hour and a half. And the question is, what may have been done to the body during that time? He then provides this answer.
The simple answer, the streamlined answer, appears to be that many metal fragments were removed from President Kennedy's body before the autopsy of record began. We have witnesses for this.
Those would be the bullet fragments, correct?
Yes. Tom Robinson of Gawler's Funeral Home saw a vial full of 10 tiny fragments, which he saw picked out of President Kennedy's brain. They were never placed in the record. Dennis David, HM1 Corpsman Dennis David, typed a receipt for a federal agent of 4 large bullet fragments. He thought it would be mass larger than 1 bullet and less mass than 2 bullets, somewhere between 1 and 2 bullets, 4 large fragments. He typed the receipt. He was allowed to handle the fragments by the federal agent. We wouldn't do that today. And the agent took the receipt, the typewriter ribbon, and the fragments, and they were never introduced in the record. So we also have 2 witnesses. To make a long story short, we have 2 witnesses to surgery on the cranium to get this evidence out. And Dr. Humes, the chief pathologist, Dr. Humes said under oath that I never had to perform a craniotomy. I never had to saw the skull open to get the brain out. And when Dr. Fink arrived late for the autopsy, he was the outsider, the Army guy, arrived at 8:30. Humes told Dr. Fink, no sawing of the skull was necessary. So the end of my response here is that we have 2 witnesses, X-ray technician Ed Reed, under oath to the review board, and Tom Robinson, to both the House committee and to the review board. Tom Robinson told the same account to both the HSCA and to us that he saw Dr. Humes saw the skull open. So I think bullet fragments were removed from the president's body before the autopsy of record began, and that's why we should have no confidence whatsoever in the autopsy.
So the claim is that during the period when the chain of custody was broken, people removed bullet fragments from the president's body. This would be to conceal the actual number of bullets that he was struck by and to try to bring the number of bullets down to a figure that could have been fired by Lee Harvey Oswald so that there wouldn't be evidence of a second shooter.
And that completes our look at Mr. Horn's testimony. And before we go to the rest of the testimony, I do want to pause and take a moment here to thank our patrons who make the show possible, including Charles K., Dr. T., Craig H., John Z., and Jeff H. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. Now, let's back up to the 1970s House Assassinations Committee, and let's hear from its staffer, Mr. Dan Hardway. What did he have to say?
Unlike the people we've heard from so far, Mr. Hardway does not begin by describing his work with the relevant organization, which in his case was the House Assassinations Committee. Instead, he starts right out of the gate by making accusations against the CIA.
For the past 62 years, the Central Intelligence Agency has actively and continuously obstructed the investigation of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy with no consequences for their actions. 10 years ago, the CIA's official historian admitted that the CIA had hidden information from the Warren Commission during its investigation. The CIA stonewalled the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, the Church Committee. The CIA was not forthcoming with the Rockefeller Commission. The CIA misled and slow-walked the Assassination Records Review Board. James Angleton's preferred method in dealing with the Warren Commission was to, quote, wait them out. The first CIA officer I ever interviewed looked at me and said, "You represent Congress. What the F is that to the CIA? You'll be gone in 2 years, and we'll still be here." In 1978, the CIA ran an illegal domestic covert operation involving an undercover officer to subvert and obstruct the House Select Committee on Assassinations. That officer served undercover. That terminology is the terminology the CIA used to describe his assignment working with the Select Committee in a statement that their representative made under penalties of perjury in a lawsuit in 2005.
Bang! So right out of the gate, he accuses the CIA of actively obstructing the investigation of the Kennedy assassination. He mentions James Jesus Angleton, and he also mentions a CIA officer who was planted to obstruct the House Assassinations Committee in the 1970s. He now backs up and begins discussing his own role in things.
I personally experienced the CIA's obstruction of the HSC investigation and can testify firsthand about what happened. In 1977 and 1978, I was employed as a researcher by the Select Committee, and I have submitted a detailed 17-page description of what happened then and since then, which I hope you will read. Briefly, my primary area of responsibility was Lee Harvey Oswald's activities in Mexico City in the fall of 1963 and the performance of the CIA in monitoring and reporting those activities, as well as other issues related to the possibility of CIA knowledge of or involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy and the cover-up of information relevant to the investigation of the assassination. In that capacity, I had a top-secret security clearance and, during the major portion of my employment, had access to unredacted CIA records, requested for review from the CIA by the Select Committee. Implicit in the focus of my work was the issue of whether the evidence from Mexico indicated any operational connection between Oswald and the CIA. Ed Lopez and I authored the report, The CIA, Oswald, and Mexico City. In the spring of 1978, among other things, I was looking hard into back-channel communications methods used by the Mexico City station, the use of an impulse camera to photograph the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, missing production from that impulse camera and from one of the photographic installations that covered the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, and David Atlee Phillips' anti-Castro propaganda operations, including his connections to stories about Oswald that rapidly appeared after the assassination of John Kennedy.
So, among other things, he was looking into Oswald's mysterious trip to Mexico City shortly before the assassination. Now he gets to the undercover CIA officer that was assigned to the House Committee.
In May of 1978, the CIA assigned an officer working in an undercover capacity to work with me and Mr. Lopez. That man was George Joanides. When Joanides was introduced to the investigation, we were told that he had no connection of any kind with any aspect of the Kennedy case that we would be investigating. In addition to that, the CIA assured us that they had no working relationship with an anti-Castro Cuban group known as DRE. They had no relationship with the DRE when representatives of that group had an encounter with Oswald in the summer of 1963, which they turned into quite a propaganda coup. The DRE was responsible for the first ever conspiracy theory about the assassination when the day after the assassination they published in their newspaper the story about Oswald's pro-Castro activities in New Orleans and proposed that Castro was behind the assassination, a story that was picked up the next day by the Washington Post and the Miami Herald. Thanks to the work of the Assassination Records Review Board, though, we now know that not only was DRE still a CIA operation all the way through 1963 and all the way up to April 1964, its controlling case officer, who oversaw the activities of the DRE and directed the DRE's activities, was no one other than George Joanides. I believe we were close to some major discoveries in 1978. And then the CIA ran an undercover operation against us. They assigned us a man who knew exactly how to keep us from finding what we were looking for. And he proceeded to do just that.
So Hardway here paints a case that the Cuban exile group DRE, which he says has been shown to be a CIA front in this period, planted a story in the press the day after the assassination that Oswald was working for the Cubans, which could have started a war with Cuba, with America invading Cuba, just like many were recommended to President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we discussed back in episodes 213 and 214 on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also in episode 228 on the secret Cuban Missile Crisis that the public didn't know about. The idea would be that those who favored an invasion weren't able to get Kennedy to authorize one, so once Kennedy was assassinated, maybe they could get their invasion by blaming the assassination on Castro. Hardway doesn't spell this out, but this is one possibility. Hardway then reveals that the man in charge of the DRE at this time was George Joanides, and that it was Joanides that the CIA assigned as its liaison to the House Assassinations Committee, even though they lied when they assured the House that Joanides had no connection with these matters. He proposed that Joanides was assigned to mislead the committee, and he says that this is what Joanides proceeded to do.
Reasonable inferences may be drawn about what they did not want us to find from the substantial circumstantial evidence that has come to light by our efforts and those of the Assassination Records Review Board and the journalist Jefferson Morley. I am a witness to these events. As such, I have a civic duty to testify. I wish I were just here. Actually, I wish I weren't here. But I wish I were just here to talk about a cover-up. But I'm not. I'm here to talk about a CIA covert operation directed against the Select Committee on Assassinations that was illegal and a violation of the CIA's charter, as well as being a felonious obstruction of a congressional investigation. That operation was and continues to be successful. Despite our testimony, and by that I mean mine, Ed Lopez's, and G. Robert Blakey's, and the clear record, no one has ever done anything about it. I have copies of the sworn testimony and exhibits of all three of us in D.C. District Court case number 17 CV 1433. I have those records with me if any of the members of this task force would like to see them. The question for this task force is whether anyone in this new generation of leaders has the backbone, the courage, the gumption to try to do something even at this late date. It's easy to admit and air the sins of our ancestors. It is much harder to admit that we build their tombs and endorse their actions by our inaction. I'm here to testify again, which is all that I can do. What will you do?
So, a very forceful call to action to do something about the deception Hardway says the CIA perpetrated.
What happened when the committee members got to ask Mr. Hardway questions?
The first question was asked by Representative Biggs of Arizona.
Mr. Hardway, you have indicated that you essentially were the subject of a covert operation as you served on the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Is that fair to say?
The CIA called it a covert assignment.
And that was from, and I can't get Mr. Joanides?
Joanides, yes.
Joanides. And you've called on the release of Mr. Joanides' file to the public. Is that fair to say?
That's fair.
And so I would actually echo that call to the chair that we see if we can get Mr. Joanides' file released.
Representative Biggs also asked him about what he made of Mr. Horn's view of the medical evidence and whether he agreed with the idea that a single shooter was not responsible.
Mr. Hardway, do you subscribe to that as part of the explanation, as well as the not a lone gunman nut theory of Mr. Horn?
I have no opinion on Mr. Horn's because I don't know anything about the medical evidence.
Okay.
In regard to why the CIA would go to the length of running an operation against us, they obviously had something that they were very desperate about hiding. And I go into that in my written statement. To do it, you have to get into the weeds of the details. But basically, just to summarize it, they were using Oswald operationally in Mexico City.
So Mr. Hardway believes that the CIA was using Oswald as an operative during his visit to Mexico City, and that's why they worked hard to cover this up. Next, Representative Eric Burleson, a Republican of Missouri, asked this question.
Mr. Hardway, it's clear that you faced firsthand the obstruction by the CIA. Would that be accurate to say in your investigations?
Yes.
And specifically, they used methods like use of sealed envelopes, redacted file, redactions that violated the 1977 Memorandum of Understanding. My question really is about what seems to be evident is that they were very much obstructing any information about Oswald's interactions in Mexico City. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Why do you think that is?
I believe that we can draw reasonable inferences from the evidence that is of record and that is very persuasive and clearly of record, that are facts and not theories, that clearly point to the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was being used in an operation in Mexico City in September of 1963 and early October of 1963. The nature of the operation was a dangle and a propaganda operation designed to discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It was designed and ran by George Joannides under the supervision of David Atlee Phillips, who had been leading the CIA's anti-FPCC efforts since 1958. And it was a very successful operation. The Cuban consulate had just recently opened. The operation allowed them to observe from a distance the interactions and reactions of not just the Cuban consulate, but the Soviet embassy to Oswald's presenting himself. And it also went a real long way to discrediting the FPCC. In addition to that, you can see the exact same pattern of operation was conducted using Oswald in New Orleans in August of 1963, in which he encountered the DRE, also encountered student groups. It's almost it's a shadow of what they then did in Mexico City. Now, the fact that, in my opinion, the fact that they ran Oswald operationally in Mexico City does not mean necessarily, or even inferentially, that they were involved in the actual assassination. It's entirely possible that on November 22nd, two of the most surprised men in the world were David Atlee Phillips and George Joannides. And consequently, the one doesn't necessarily lead to the other in any way, shape, or form. But stop and think about it. If they were running an operation in which the accused shooter was involved as an asset, either witting or unwitting, think about the motivation for cover-up. It had to be something extraordinary that they were covering up in order to violate their charter, and in spite of the Houston Agreement that agrees not to prosecute CIA officers for crimes committed in the furtherance of their duties in the United States, in spite of that, they feloniously obstructed a congressional investigation. There had to be something significant that they were covering up, and what that significance was. And basically, David Robarge, the CIA historian, has in a backhanded way admitted that in things he's written, was the use of Oswald in an operation in Mexico City.
So you think that it was, if you had to be pressed on it, it sounds like there's two scenarios. One is that Oswald, I mean, both scenarios, Oswald had some involvement in connection with the CIA. But in one scenario, he's being directed by individuals in the CIA to commit the assassination. And then the other scenario is that he did it and they just flubbed. They didn't pick up on the fact that he was planning this assassination.
I don't think we can draw any inference from the evidence on any of that as to whether or not he was being directed in the assassination. I don't think that David Phillips and George Joannides were directing him in the assassination. I don't think they would have been using him in Mexico if they did.
Some of the documentation indicates recently that from the 2017 release that he was not alone when he went to Mexico City.
I can't say that he wasn't alone. From the research we did in Mexico City, what we couldn't rule out was that he was imitated, or that another person was there pretending to be Oswald, or that some of the telephone conversations that were recorded on the taps at the Russian and Cuban facilities were actually Oswald speaking. In fact, it's pretty clear that some of the calls that claimed to be Oswald were not Oswald.
So there's a good bit there. First, Hardway believes that the CIA had been using Oswald as part of an operation in Mexico City before the assassination, though he says that someone also may have impersonated Oswald, and it appears that it was not Oswald speaking in some of the taped phone conversations we have from taps on the phones in the Russian and Cuban embassies in Mexico City. This is sometimes known as the two Oswalds theory, and we can discuss it in the future. Whether or not there was an Oswald imposter, Hardway does believe that the CIA was using Oswald as part of an operation. This does not mean that the CIA or elements of it planned the assassination. Someone from the CIA may have, though Hardway doesn't think personally that the two CIA individuals he names were among such plotters. Otherwise, he says these two individuals wouldn't have used Oswald in Mexico City. It's also possible that other people in the CIA were behind the assassination. And finally, it's possible that after being used by the CIA, Oswald decided to kill the president on his own, and the CIA didn't know anything about it. So Hardway is urging that we be cautious in the inferences we draw. The next question was asked by Representative Eli Crane, a Republican from Arizona.
Mr. Hardway, I want to move to you next. You talked about the obstruction of a federal investigation that you yourself witnessed. You were on the House Select Committee for Assassination, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What year would that have been?
1977 and 1978. The obstruction occurred entirely in 1978.
What was your role in that investigation?
My role was a researcher with primary responsibility for researching Lee Harvey Oswald's activities in Mexico City and the CIA response to that.
We've heard about some of the administrative roadblocks that the CIA put up for you. Did you have any direct verbal communication with anybody at the CIA?
Oh, yeah, frequently.
Can you tell us about some of those conversations and how it might have been conceived as obstruction?
Well, when we first started, we had unlimited, unexpurgated access. We had 2 clerks assigned to us. We had our office at the CIA. Pretty much went to work out there every morning. We'd ask for a file. They would go get it. We would review it. It was unredacted and given to us in its original state. After they brought George Joannides in, he began slowly tightening down the process. We were no longer working with 2 clerks who went and got us our files. We had to file formally requests through him to get the files, and we started experiencing significant delays in the files that we would get. We started noticing that the files we would get would have obvious things missing from them. Then he went so far as to actually start putting parts of the files in envelopes and leaving them in the files, so that what we would get is we would sign that we'd seen the files, but we weren't allowed to open the stuff that he had placed in envelopes. That came back to haunt us later in dealing with the final report and some of the things we were trying to get out of them, when they would tell the chairman of the committee, he's seen that, here's where he signed for the file. And I would have to explain to Chairman Stokes that, no, that was not in the file when I saw it, because that was what I was looking for, and it was not there. It must have been in one of the envelopes. And so he eventually just shut us down. It culminated on one file that I really wanted to see. When it was presented to me, Mr. Joannides showed up himself to give it to me. He was actually bouncing on his toes. Him and Scott Breckenridge brought the file to me at the CIA, called me back out there to see it. It had not just been redacted, it had been retyped with the redactions in white space as it had been retyped. It was a report on a debriefing of a certain person. I exploded. I acted like a very angry 24-year-old and had choice words for both of them, and stormed out of the office and went back to the headquarters. I subsequently, thanks to Judge Tunheim's work, saw the memorandum to the record that Mr. Breckenridge wrote. And the memorandum for the record says that the file was shown to me and, quote, no objections were recorded, close quote. Notice the way, you have to watch what the CIA says. He didn't say that I didn't make any, which is what everyone infers from what he said. What he said was none were recorded, and that's because he made the record.
So here, Mr. Hardway describes the tactics that he says George Joannides used to obstruct the House investigation into the Kennedy assassination. The final question for Mr. Hardway was asked by Representative Nancy Mace, a Republican from South Carolina. And listeners may remember her because she's also overseen congressional hearings on UAP, or UFOs, as we covered in episode 351 on the Immaculate Constellation program. Here's what she had to ask.
Mr. Hardway, you worked for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which investigated the assassination of JFK. You had firsthand interactions with the CIA as you worked to get the truth. Based on what you witnessed, do you believe the CIA engaged in a concerted effort to cover up certain facts related to the assassination of President Kennedy?
Yes.
Do you believe the efforts to obstruct congressional investigations into the assassination of President Kennedy by the CIA you've described violated federal law?
People more expert in federal criminal law than I am have expressed that opinion to me and have expressed that opinion under oath.
Based on what you know, what relationship, if any, did the CIA have with Lee Harvey Oswald prior to the assassination of President Kennedy?
Based upon the circumstantial evidence of record, and it is overwhelming, they had they used him as either a witting or an unwitting agent of influence.
Seems that way, doesn't it? Do you believe there was evidence to suggest the CIA was using Lee Harvey Oswald in active intelligence operations shortly before the assassination of President Kennedy?
Yes.
So Mr. Hardway wouldn't himself comment on whether the CIA's actions with respects to Congress were illegal, but he said that others more expert in federal law have said so under oath. He said that the evidence is that the CIA used Oswald as an agent of influence and that there is evidence that he was being used in intelligence operations shortly before the assassination.
We've now arrived at the two witnesses who were active at the time of the Kennedy assassination. The first was Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden. What did he have to say?
Unfortunately, his testimony was plagued by technical problems. He's quite elderly and he wasn't able to attend the hearing in person, so they had him testify by video link. Unfortunately, his microphone apparently was not hooked up at first, so they had to stop his testimony and come back to him once the microphone problem was resolved. Unfortunately, when it was resolved, they apparently didn't get his audio feed hooked into the C-SPAN broadcast, so we couldn't hear anything that he said in his opening statement, and it was maddening because he has a really compelling story, and I really wanted to hear his testimony. Fortunately, I later located another feed of the testimony, and this one did have Bolden's testimony such that it was at least audible. The audio quality isn't the best, but it's good enough that I can at least use brief clips from it. And we'll have a link to this version of the hearing so that you can hear what Bolden had to say. One of the first things that Bolden says in his testimony is this.
Now, everything that I will tell you today, none of it came from research. I am not a researcher. Each fact that I give you today, they were from my specific actions. No one has prompted me to say anything. I've been waiting for this opportunity since 1964.
So Bolden says he's not a researcher, so everything he's going to testify to is from his personal knowledge, which is good since we can have less confidence in conclusions drawn by researchers than in things that people know from their personal experience. I plan to do a future episode about Bolden and what happened to him, and we'll have a link to information about him and to his memoir, The Echo from Dealey Plaza, so you can read it for yourself. But basically, he worked both on President Kennedy's protection team and at the Chicago Secret Service office. Among other things, he states that he observed a pattern of misconduct under Secret Service agents. They were, for example, drinking when they shouldn't be, and they expressed an unwillingness to put their lives at risk for President Kennedy. In his testimony, Bolden stated,
In becoming an agent, I found that there was so many cracks in its petition. The agents were drinking on duty. Some of them were smoking weed. They were going around with prostitutes when they were supposed to be on duty. And they were particularly racist against President and Robert Kennedy. There were some who were also worried about the fact that they thought that President Kennedy and his family were trying to form a dynasty. I heard a lot of talk about them finding a dynasty. that President Kennedy would be first, then Robert Kennedy, and then Kennedy. And then when that happened, then the Catholics would run America for the next 100 years. And that had to be stopped.
Now, hearing fellow Secret Service agents saying that the formation of a Kennedy dynasty needed to be stopped does not mean that they were going to actively kill any of the Kennedys. Whoever said this may have only meant that it needed to be stopped at the ballot box. But between the misconduct he uncovered, like getting drunk and high and putting themselves in compromising situations like cavorting with prostitutes while on duty, and being unwilling to put themselves at risk for the president, you can see how Agent Bolden's assessment that there were many cracks in the President Kennedy's protection is justified, and how that could have contributed to his assassination, something the Secret Service would then want to cover up. There's also more to this that Bolden didn't go into in his recent testimony before Congress. Elsewhere, Bolden has stated that there was an earlier plot to kill President Kennedy on November 2nd, or 3 weeks before it happened, in Chicago, when a team of snipers would fire on him while he was riding in a motorcade. But when this was learned, the November 2nd trip to Chicago was called off, so the assassination was rescheduled for his Dallas trip on the 22nd. And we know that parts of this are true. But when Bolden started testifying to the Warren Commission about these matters, he was framed for bribery and later put in a mental institution and given drugs to make him look crazy and prevent him from testifying. And he did testify to this, as we'll see momentarily. First, though, when Chairwoman Luna asked him a question, he stated,
"If you can, real quick, what did you observe about the Secret Service investigation of President Kennedy's assassination?"
It was one of the greatest cover-ups of a crime. Now, the Secret Service initiated so many cover-ups. Number one, the number of bullet fragments that were found in the car. Harry Gagline, on November the 26th, looked at the car, the assassination automobile, and he found two cartridges laying on the front floorboard. They were very damaged. And he also observed a bullet hole in the windshield. And now he was told not to let the FBI know about any of this and to get the car to Michigan somewhere where they could put a new windshield in and clean the car up.
So here, Bolden says that the evidence from the limousine the president was riding in was tampered with, which is a commonly made charge. Here, Bolden apparently isn't describing things he was an eyewitness to, and I wish he said more about how he knew this. Earlier, he said that he wasn't a researcher, and he, could have learned this by talking to the agent involved, but he also indicates that he didn't have good relations with many of his fellow agents. So I'm not sure how he got this information, and I'm not sure how to weigh it. However, he next goes on to describe things that he was an eyewitness to because they happened to him.
No, the biggest thing that I was talking about was the violations of constitutional rights that followed, especially in my case, simply because I wouldn't be quiet. I was framed, I was arrested, they attempted to declare me insane. And I was put in Springfield, Missouri, forced to take drugs, mind-boggling drugs. Now, that stemmed from the fact that on the 18th of November 1964, I was called to Washington, D.C., and they told me they were going to give me another name, change my identity, and that I would become another individual. And that, in fact, did happen. And I think that they were setting me up for assassination myself. I think that that's what was going on. Because when they sent me to the penitentiary, they made it clear that it was a case of my being so agitated about the assassination that I wouldn't keep quiet.
There's much more to Agent Bolden's story, and we'll cover it in a future episode. But the bottom line is that he believes that he was actively persecuted, imprisoned, and drugged because he wouldn't keep quiet about what he had learned about the Kennedy assassination. I find it interesting here that he says he was offered what is now known as witness protection. The modern U.S. witness protection program wasn't instituted until 1970, but that doesn't mean that there weren't similar things that existed before, especially with intelligence services. Bolden believes that this offer may have been to get him out of the public eye so that he could be quietly assassinated himself. I'm not presently sure what to make of that assessment, but he was imprisoned and drugged. Eventually, he was released from custody, and in 2022, he was pardoned by President Biden. In any event, you can see why I really wanted to hear Agent Bolden's testimony.
What do you make of his charge that the Secret Service perpetrated a cover-up in this case?
Oh, I find that entirely credible. Having a president assassinated on your watch is the most embarrassing thing possible for the Secret Service, and it's even worse if, as we have other evidence for, there was a pattern of misconduct and loose security on the part of his protective detail. So the Secret Service would be highly motivated to cover up the misconduct of its agents in this situation. That doesn't mean that they were actively involved in the situation, but it does mean that they would be highly motivated to cover up their own misconduct in the aftermath of the assassination.
Okay, we have just one witness left to hear from, so we're going to jump back in time to the day of the assassination itself, November 22nd, 1963, and we're going to hear from Dr. Don Curtis, who was one of the physicians that treated President Kennedy and tried to save his life. So this is the big one. What did Dr. Curtis have to say?
His opening statement begins this way. He initially describes how he became involved in the effort to save the president's life and what procedures they were using.
My story begins when I left my office to go to get something to eat before I did surgery. And to do that, I had to go by the emergency room. And when I went by the emergency room, a policeman came out of the door into the emergency room, grabbed my shoulder, and he said, "Are you a doctor?" And I said, "Yes." And he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me into the emergency room and took me to the trauma room. And when I looked in the trauma room, there was 3 people in the room. One was the president, and he was laying on the gurney, and an extremist. And the other was Dr. Carrico, James Carrico, and one nurse. And the reason Dr. Carrico was on his own is because the Governor Conley was brought in before him, and he was very seriously ill, and the staff, all the staff in the emergency room went to help him, and then Dr. Carrico was left to take care of the president by himself. So I walked in, and he had just placed a endotracheal tube, and then I walked up and held the tube so he could connect the bird machine to it. The bird machine is an intermittent positive pressure respiratory help, and it works by filling the lungs and then letting the air come back out. And the way it works is that the inspiration continues to a certain pressure, and then the expiration continues to another low pressure. And therefore, that spaces the breathing. Normally, that's about 10 or 15 minutes, 10 or 15 times during a minute. But in this case, it was going about 100 to 125 conversions in a minute. So it was rat-a-tat-tat-tat, and I knew the machine. Dr. Carrico knew the machine. We used it a lot. And so the question was, is the machine not working, or is there tube blocked or what? And he had placed the tube in, and if you place an endotracheal tube, you place it between the cords, and then you know you're in the trachea and you've got an airway. But in this case, apparently we didn't have an airway. And finally, it was a question, is it the machine or what is it? And so finally it got to a point where I said, Jimmy, what do you want to do? And he had already made a decision. He said, tracheostomy, we need to do a trach. So if there was going to be a trach, well, I knew the shirt would be in the way. So I moved around to take the shirt off, and the nurse was way ahead of me with her scissors. We took the shirt off. And in the meantime, Dr. Malcolm Perry came in, and he was on the medical staff. He's a professor in the medical school, senior to Dr. Carrico. So he decided to do the tracheostomy. And then Dr. Carrico said to me, Don, why don't you go ahead and do a cut down on that left leg? And so I went and did that. A cut down is a very small operation, but it is a very important thing to do. The reason for doing it is that most people come in to the emergency room as be bled out, where their blood volume is low. And if the blood volume is low, well, then the heart doesn't have anything to pump, and that is a cause of death. Well, if you can replenish the blood volume quickly, well, then that causes a better chance of survival. So the cut down is to put a catheter in a vein so that you can get the fluid in faster. And the operation is to make an incision across the front of the shin and dissect out the saphenous vein, which is a large vein that goes right up the front of the leg. Put a catheter, make a little hole in the catheter, put the catheter in that, and then put a stitch around the vein to close it off and hold the catheter in place. The nurse at the meantime has the bag hanging with IV fluid in 500 cc's in a collar that she can pump up. And when she does that, well, she it forces the fluid into the vein. And so that's what I did. Then after I did that, then Dr. Perry had already completed the tracheostomy, and I was looked up, and then the president heart had stopped or it wasn't running. They put a monitor on the president, found out his heart was not bleeding, and so external cardiac massage was being done by Kemp Clark, the chief of neurosurgery.
But now Dr. Curtis describes a turning point.
Kemp Clark went and picked up the head and stopped the resuscitation. This wound is not compatible with life. You got dead quiet. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody said anything for the longest time. Then he said, okay. And he looked at, by that time, the chiefs of all the surgical services were against the wall across the room from me, and all in white coats, and they had responded to the call that they needed help. And so he said, pointed them out, I need to tell each of you individually what the wound is, so that you can say that later on. And then he described the wound as about a 3 or 4 inch hole in the posterior cranium. And then there's a bullet hole in the right temple. So he described it that the bullet came through the temple into the cranial vault, created a huge pressure in the cranial vault, and when the bullet finally tumbled into the posterior wall, it blew it out. And he explained all that individually to these 7 doctors.
So according to Dr. Curtis, Dr. Kemp Clark saw a large 3 to 4 inch wound on the back of President Kennedy's head, and that the wound was not compatible with life, meaning it was fatal. He thus stopped efforts to save the president's life. He also saw a small entrance wound on his right temple, and he concluded in essence that the president had been shot from the front, not from the back where the school book depository was. Dr. Clark then took all 7 doctors in attendance aside and told them what he had seen so that they could describe it accurately later.
Those doctors knew what was happening and what happened to the president and the wound that killed him, and they never were called by the Warren Commission.
So despite these doctors being briefed by an eyewitness just after the assassination, they were not called to testify before the Warren Commission. Dr. Curtis then described what happened next at Parkland Hospital.
After that, I stood there and I couldn't leave because Mrs. Kennedy was to my right and I couldn't get past her. So I had to just stay there for a while. But then eventually everybody left and I went around to look at the wound and I couldn't see it was laying on the pillow, but I could see where it was. Then I left there and went into an adjacent room. The X-ray waiting room was a large room, and right in the middle of the room was Lyndon Johnson, and he was telling people to go talk on the phone, and he was obviously he'd set the government up, and he had taken control. And then I looked around, and I couldn't see a single person that I thought looked like Secret Service. I couldn't see any weapons that were protecting him. And so I was a little uncomfortable being there myself, because at that time we had no idea what was going on with our government. We didn't know if the government would be intact or not. But it made me feel good to know that he was right in the middle of the room, and he was the president. He was absolutely fearless. Then I wondered, why is he so absolutely fearless? I mean, because if it's a coup, he'd be the next one to go. So with that, I left, and that's what I learned in the emergency, in the trauma room.
But then they were later given some unusual instructions.
Later, we found out that the residents and interns should not talk to each other about this. And so we didn't. And Dr. Carrico and I would have lunch together many times, often just him and me, and we never mentioned it to each other.
So someone apparently told him not to discuss the president's assassination amongst themselves. But since Dr. Curtis and the others had seen an entrance wound on the front of the president's head and an exit wound on the back of his head, Dr. Curtis wants to make it clear that the magic bullet theory doesn't work.
One thing I'd like to get started today is that the magic bullet was a product of the Warren Commission that doesn't make any sense.
This was confirmed when Representative Biggs of Arizona questioned him.
Dr. Curtis, you indicated that you had no doubt that the wound that you observed to the back of President Kennedy's head was an exit gunshot wound. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you concluded after review that it did not align, his wound did not align with the theory that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in shooting President Kennedy. Is that true?
Yes.
And I guess you struggle to this day to understand the Warren Commission's theory about the president's shooter and how it seems to have discord with what you actually observed that day. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So here we have Dr. Curtis, an eyewitness who treated the president himself, saying that the wounds he saw with his own eyes were not consistent with a single shooter, and therefore the account of events provided by the Warren Commission was incorrect. That's noteworthy. Now here, Representative Tim Burchett, a Republican of Tennessee, asks him some questions that lead to a discussion of the bullets that were fired.
Dr. Curtis, what happened when the Warren Commission called you to testify about what you knew about JFK's wounds?
Well, the Warren Commission hasn't called me to testify at all.
Not at all? Can you explain what condition, when President Kennedy arrived in the emergency room, what was his condition at that point?
He had already died.
Okay. How many wounds did you observe on President Kennedy?
How many wounds? President Kennedy had a wound to, of course, the big wound to his head.
Right.
But he also had a wound to his throat And I've got a little diagram here. I can point that out, how that worked, if you'd like me to.
And that wouldn't have been a single bullet wound, though, right? They talk about this magical bullet that traveled. That would have been more than one bullet, you think?
Magic bullet, it was not, it didn't strike the president at all.
Okay. Yeah, that was a clean bullet. I saw the picture. Please show the diagram.
Okay. The bullets that were fired, the blue bullet was the bullet that arrived first. And you can see it started probably from the railroad trestle, which is to the southwest, and came up and first struck President Kennedy before he got out from under the tree that prevented the window shooter from shooting. Then, and we know that because the Zapruder film showed President Kennedy holding his throat in real distress when the Zapruder film started, and he had already been shot, and that wound to his throat would have killed him. It did kill him, because we know from the tracheostomy that we had to do that the bullet to his throat obstructed the trachea, and so he had taken his last breath before that. Also, the bullet that struck President Kennedy in the temple killed him also, because he just removed about a third of his brain. And the part of the brain that it removed was in the posterior part of the brain, and that is the area of the brain that controls the parasympathetic and the automatic nervous system. And so the two bullets that came from the Conley, from the window, one struck Conley, and it's the only thing that it did. It went in Conley's shoulder, went through his chest, came out of his chest into his left wrist, into his left leg, and that indicates that the bullet was coming from the north, going southeast, southwest, and that bullet was only for Governor Conley. The other bullet that came out was this other one here. Then that would have been the magic bullet. That's the one that went in the president's back. And the Warren Commission then wanted to choose that bullet to be the magic bullet, which went through the top of his head. Now that's essentially what I wanted to say.
Okay, and that was, how many bullets did you say? 3 or 4?
That were fired?
Yes, sir.
4.
Okay, and that was a bolt action Italian carbine.
2 of the
allegedly.
bullets came from the front.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I know, but they were trying to tell us if Lee Harvey Oswald was the
only bullets that came from the window were 2 bullets, and 3 bullets came from the window. 1 hit the curb, the other hit Conley, and the other one went in the president's back. And that's well documented.
So according to Dr. Curtis's understanding, there were at least 4 bullets fired. The first bullet came from the railroad trestle. It struck President Kennedy in the throat, which was responsible for the entrance wound on his throat, which doctors later enlarged with a tracheostomy to get him air. This bullet inflicted a fatal wound because it closed the president's airway and prevented him from breathing, and it was several minutes before they could get him to Parkland Hospital. This bullet also was fired while the president's limousine was blocked from the school book depository by a tree. And Dr. Curtis says we know it was fired then because of how you can see in the Zapruder film that President Kennedy has moved his hands to his throat. Another bullet impacted President Kennedy in the temple, causing another entrance wound on the front of his head, meaning that it had been fired in front of the limousine, not the book depository in the rear. Based on the diagram Dr. Curtis uses, this bullet came from the grassy knoll alongside the limousine. And this bullet also caused a fatal wound because it blew a third of his brain out of the back of his head. This was the rear part of his brain, which is needed to run the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems that control essentially bodily functions like your heartbeat. A third bullet came from behind, so apparently from the school book depository, and it struck Governor Connolly in the back and then injured his wrist and then embedded itself into his leg. And the fourth and final bullet, also from behind and apparently from the depository, struck the president's back, and it remained relatively undeformed. At least, if I understand Dr. Curtis's reconstruction correctly, some of what he said seemed a little contradictory. Now, Representative Crane of Arizona asks this question.
You were there in the emergency room the day that the president was brought in?
Yes.
How old were you, sir?
How old was I?
Yeah.
26.
26. And what did you observe when they brought the president in?
The president was already in the room before I arrived. And what I observed about him, that he had probably already deceased.
Since you were a dental surgeon, why did they bring you into the operation room?
That's one thing our inspector asked me. What is a dentist doing operating on the president? Then I had to qualify myself. The training that I have would encompass those particular procedures. And that's a simple procedure, and I did it well, and I just knew how to do it. There was nobody else there to do it, and I did it because Dr. Carrico asked me to do it.
Can you tell us about the wounds that you observed on the president and how they differ from what came out in some of the reporting?
The wounds on the president were to his throat and to his head and to his back. The wound to his throat would have killed him. The wound to his head definitely would have killed him. The wound to his back would not have killed him.
Did the wounds to his throat and his head look like completely separate wounds?
They were two separate wounds. The one, well, let me show it to you. The blue wound was sent from the railroad trestle all the way over to kill him right here, and that went to his throat. And the way that killed him is that it obstructed the trachea, and he couldn't breathe. So he would have been dead before he reached the hospital just simply because of that wound. The other wound that he had to his head would have killed him instantly because it removed about a third of his brain.
Here, Representative Crane asked a reasonable question. Why would Dr. Curtis, a dental surgeon, have been operating on the president? But Dr. Curtis gave what seems to be a reasonable answer to me. In an emergency like a presidential assassination, you grab anyone you can who can do what you need to do and press them into service. So if you've got a dental surgeon on hand and he can do what you need, you use him. Now, Representative Mace of South Carolina asks a question.
You were one of the physicians who treated President Kennedy at Parkland Memorial Hospital after he was shot. You were better situated than almost anyone to see President Kennedy's physical condition when he arrived at the hospital. And yet you've said, I can't reconcile my knowledge of what I saw with the findings of the government, is what you said at the time. Yes. In your medical opinion, what do you attribute as the cause of President Kennedy's wounds?
The cause of his death?
Mm-hmm.
The two bullets were fired from the front, caused his death. And either one of them would have. The blue and the green,
yes, sir,
bullets.
And in your medical, in your opinion, how does this differ from the findings of the government as to the cause of the wounds to the president? How did this differ? How were they different?
The government wanted the president to have died from the window, from the bullets fall from the window, because that would have caused the Harvey Oswald to have done it. And they went to great lengths to make those two bullets do the job. And those two bullets did not do the job. One went in the president's back, and the other the other went into Governor Connally. So those 2 bullets didn't do anything to kill President Kennedy.
Okay, my last question, Dr. Curtis, you ready? Are the wounds you observed consistent with the government's conclusion Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone?
No.
And finally, Chairwoman Luna of Florida asks a couple of questions.
Dr. Curtis, was there anyone specifically on the Warren Commission that made the attempted effort, or that you felt you were being pressured to either be silenced on what you saw and or bullied and or threatened into not speaking the truth?
I was never pressured to be silent, but I did have action with Arlen Specter that was not good.
What happened, sir?
He did a deposition for me and had not told me about it ahead of time. The nurse leaned in the operating room that morning and said, the Warren Commission is in town. If you have time, go down and talk to them. So I finished my cases and went down and talked to our inspector. He was friendly and nice and was very well groomed in a beautiful suit, shiny shoes, and I had my hair all messed up in a scrub suit, dirty shoes. So it was definitely top down. And he was friendly and nice, and then started asking me biographical questions that made it obvious to me that he knew the answers to the question before he asked it. And so that made me wonder, why on earth does he know all that about me? Then he said, what did you see about the exit wound? Well, there wasn't one. Really? No, there wasn't one. And then, so he asked me 4 more times about the exit wound. And the last time he asked me is, Dr. Curtis, every other doctor has suggested and testified that there was an exit wound, and you didn't see it? No, I didn't. And so during this, the visit that I had with him was maybe about 20 or 30 minutes. And during that time, he made me feel that I had a reason for being in the trauma room to be sure the president died. Now, I had a wife and 2 babies at home that were completely dependent on me. If I lost my residency, it would be terribly a big problem for me. So he said, okay, now, you should wait here for a little bit before we do your deposition. I said, deposition? He said, yes, you're having to give him a deposition today. And I said, well, I didn't know that. He said, well, I sent you a letter, which I didn't get. He said, do you want a lawyer? And I said, do I need a lawyer? He said, fella, you're the only one in this room that knows if you need a lawyer. Do you want me to get you one? I said, no, I don't think so. But he asked me over and over again about the exit wound. Then we got in on, then he got the committee together, and nobody that I'd ever seen before sitting behind the table, and put me on a high stool uncomfortably. And I remember my foot kept slipping off that bottle rung, and then started asking me questions. Never did bring up the exit wound. He never did say a thing about it. Till at the last, he said, Dr. Curtis, did you see anything that was like a puncture or a opening in the trachea and or the throat? And I said, no. He said, but then I thought, well, the blood was right over that, so I couldn't have seen it. So I said, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. Thank you for Dr. Curtis. That's what he wanted.
Would it be fair to say that other doctors that you worked with that were in the room that day that were responding to President Kennedy's wounds had the same observations as you? Yes or no?
There were only 2 of us that thought of the throat before the tracheostomy was done.
Okay.
And is that the answer?
Whatever you would like to share with Congress, sir.
So I saw it, and there was no exit wounds. That's what our inspector wanted, was an exit wound, because the magic bullet had to exit the throat to go in to get over Conley, which couldn't have happened. The magic bullet would have had to make 3 90-degree turns to do what it did. It was coming down from the window, would have had to turn a right angle to be horizontal through the neck, would have had to turn right again to go over to where Governor Connolly was, would have to turn right again to go into Governor Connolly. It doesn't work.
Yes, sir. I can speak for myself. I do not believe in the magic bullet theory.
Bullets don't do that.
No, do not. I do not, sir.
To me, the most interesting part of this final exchange is what Dr. Curtis recalls about his interaction with Arlen Specter. He felt that he could not give Specter the testimony that Specter wanted about exit wounds on the front of the president's body, which would have implied that the president had been shot exclusively from the back where the book depository was. And if I understand Dr. Curtis correctly, he perceived that in their private conversation, Specter suggested to Dr. Curtis that Dr. Curtis intended to make sure that the president died, implicated him as at least an accessory to murder after the fact. Hence the suggestion that only he knew if he needed a lawyer. The implication would be that if Dr. Curtis strayed too far into expressing his true views, that Specter would make sure that he was charged as an accessory to murder. So when Specter held the deposition, Dr. Curtis was quite circumspect in what he said, and Specter didn't give him the opportunity to testify to there being an entrance wound in the president's throat. He simply asked Dr. Curtis if he'd seen any opening in the president's throat before the tracheotomy. Dr. Curtis says no, but that the area was covered with blood, which meant that there could have been an opening there. This didn't settle the question of whether it was an entrance wound or an exit wound, and so Specter could spin it as an exit wound, and he abruptly stopped the questioning at this point. In any event, Dr. Curtis has made it abundantly clear that he does not believe the injuries he saw on President Kennedy were consistent with the single bullet theory proposed by Arlen Specter and the Warren Commission. He believes that President Kennedy was struck twice by bullets that could not have come from the book depository behind the limousine, that one bullet was fired from the railroad trestle in front of it and created an entrance wound in the president's throat, and one bullet was fired from the grassy knoll beside the car and created an entrance wound in the president's right temple, and that both of these wounds would have been fatal.
Let's take a step back now and look at the bigger picture. What do you make of the testimony that these witnesses offered Congress?
Well, I find it all fascinating. I think that in her testimony, Ms. Cole, the historian, raised some worthwhile points, and the cautionary note that she sounded about not leaping to conspiracy and cover-up as explanations was really well taken. However, she didn't present any rebuttal evidence, and she didn't really contribute anything of substance to the questions of what happened with the Kennedy assassination and the government's response to it. On the other hand, Judge Tunheim of the 1990s Assassinations Records Review Board's testimony indicated that he witnessed the FBI and CIA conduct a cover-up after the assassination, particularly in regard to the agency's awareness of or involvement with Lee Harvey Oswald prior to the assassination. And they continued to do this in the 1990s, such as when the CIA misled the Assassinations Records Review Board about George Joanides. He also indicated that despite President Trump's order to release all the files that have been collected, there are still files out there that have not been released or even in some cases collected. Judge Tunheim's colleague from the review board, Douglas Horn, made some really explosive accusations, stating that not only is a bunch of evidence regarding the assassination missing, something that could be due to either incompetence or malfeasance, but evidence, including the Zapruder film, has been deliberately altered. The charge of altering evidence is very serious. I've heard it before. I'm open, but not presently convinced, but I will continue to investigate. I'd also note that Mr. Horn's testimony appears to be significantly based not on his own personal experience, but on conclusions he's made as an assassination researcher, so this needs to be borne in mind. When we move back to the 1970s and hear from Dan Hardway of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he offers confirmatory testimony concerning the CIA's executing a cover-up, particularly in regard to George Joannides as the CIA's liaison to the House Committee and lying about his previous connection to Oswald back in 1963, which reportedly included Joannides heading up a group of Cuban exiles who proposed the first conspiracy theory the day after the assassination by suggesting that Oswald was working for Fidel Castro, which could have gotten us into the war that some wanted during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Hardway also proposes that the CIA had been using Oswald as an agent of influence, though he points out that this does not mean the CIA or elements of it were responsible for the assassination, that it's possible that Oswald decided to kill the president on his own, which then surprised his CIA handlers, prompting them to cover up their connection with him. Moving back to the 1960s, Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden offered testimony about the misconduct, lax security, and unprofessional attitudes towards Kennedy that he uncovered in the Secret Service, as well as his own persecution when he was willing to speak up about these. So we've heard a good bit of testimony supporting the idea that there was a cover-up on the part of multiple agencies, including the FBI, the CIA, and the Secret Service. This doesn't mean that any of them caused the assassination, but each of them had things that they would want to hide after such a shocking event, and that would lead them to cover up parts of the truth. What I find most compelling is the testimony of Dr. Don Curtis as one of the first eyewitnesses to the wounds the president suffered. I find his testimony that they were entrance wounds on the front of the president's body to be very important. If there were such wounds, then the president had to be shot from the front, not just from the rear, and that would mean at least 2 gunmen, or 3 on the scenario proposed by Dr. Curtis. That would then mean that there was a conspiracy to kill the president. It wouldn't tell us who was involved in the conspiracy, and there are lots of possibilities because lots of people hated Kennedy. He kind of had a knack for honking people off, including the CIA, the Mafia, the Soviets, Cuban exiles, and various others. And we don't even know from the testimony presented here today if Lee Harvey Oswald was one of the killers. He could have been exactly what he says he was, a patsy. But I do think that Dr. Curtis's testimony should be taken quite seriously.
Where does that leave you with respect to the overall question of the assassination itself? Are you willing at this point to say that the Warren Commission was simply wrong and that there was a conspiracy to kill the president?
Actually, no. What we heard today was compelling testimony, and it needs to be taken seriously, but some of it was based on research rather than personal experiences of the witnesses, and even eyewitness testimony can be mistaken or the result of misinterpretation. I think Ms. Coe is right that we shouldn't just leap to conspiracy and cover up his explanations, no matter how exciting they are. I'm thus still presently in the position I was before. I think you're not crazy if you propose a conspiracy, but you're also not crazy if you propose Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone nut. I thus think that the testimony we heard today adds weight to the conspiracy explanation, but I don't think it proves it conclusively. In particular, I want to go back and review what other doctors who examined President Kennedy's body had to say. So I'll keep researching this issue and reporting my findings to the Mysterious World audience.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line?
The assassination of President John F. Kennedy was a tragic event that altered the course of American history and world history. I think there is compelling evidence of a cover-up after the fact by government agencies, but this doesn't resolve the issue of what happened with the assassination itself. I think that it's possible Oswald acted alone. I also think it's possible he was part of a conspiracy, and I think it's possible that he was used by a conspiracy as a patsy. The testimony we heard today adds weight to the idea that a conspiracy was involved, but I need to do more research, and I'll let you know what conclusions I come to as I come to them.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we offer?
We'll have a link to Jacqueline Kennedy's interviews in William Manchester's book, The Death of a President, also Abraham Bolden's book, The Echo from Dealey Plaza, the full C-SPAN coverage of the hearings, as well as information about Abraham Bolden, also Douglas Horne's written testimony, including additional facts he didn't he didn't speak in his testimony, but he submitted it into the congressional record. Also, information about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and a Wikipedia article about the book, The Death of a President.
Now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. This feedback will be from our recent episode on animal end-of-life experiences. And the first one comes from Francis Taco on YouTube, who writes, "You'd be amazed by the attachment that people have to their pets, treating them almost like children. My sister was suicidal after her 11-year-old husky died. I get feeling sad over a pet dying, but they are not human souls. No reason to look forward to them in heaven if you have proper Catholic formation. You get to see our Lord and Maker. My dead pet is not even an afterthought. This truth might hurt some feelings, though."
Well, so I guess I'd take a middle position. I understand that, I understand feeling sad when a pet dies, and I, especially, if one's a child or something like that. So I also agree that, as the Catechism says, we shouldn't give animals the affection that's due only to humans. So we shouldn't be too invested in them. But it is sad when a beloved pet dies. On the other hand, I'd recommend going back and listening to our episode on animal afterlife, because you allude to, to looking forward to heaven and not really thinking about pets if you have proper Catholic formation, which I took to mean that animals won't be there. But that's not part of Catholic teaching. That's a theological opinion that has been proposed. And so you can have perfectly proper Catholic formation and also think that animals are going to be in heaven. When it comes to the argument that you get to see your Lord and Maker, so a dead pet wouldn't even be an afterthought, well, you could say the same thing about other human beings. I'm going to get to see my Lord and Maker Jesus. Why would I even think about another human being? Because they're on a different level than Jesus. Well, that's true, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to have experiences or thoughts of other people in heaven. We clearly are. And if we can have other experiences and thoughts of finite human beings in contrast to our infinite Lord, we could also have thoughts and experiences of finite animals in addition to experiences of our infinite Lord.
All right. And then our next feedback comes from KnightU2160 on YouTube, who writes, "Could it be problematic to have both seeking solitude and seeking companionship to be a sign of an end-of-life experience? It seems to me that every death must either be alone or in company, so especially when dealing with nonverbal creatures, how can we really know if either has any meaning to them? My own mother may be an example of waiting to die alone. She died on a Good Friday while the family was away attending Triduum services. Still, if she had died when we were still gathered around her, then she would have fit the waiting for us to be together profile too. It would seem like a win for end-of-life experiences either way, or a win for chalking it up to coincidence either way, whichever you prefer."
I think that there are two things that tend to happen in end-of-life experiences. People frequently do want both. They want a retreat and they want to say a final goodbye. And so they do both. And in a human case, we frequently have them retreat to their deathbed, and then their relatives come and they can say their final goodbyes, or they phone them and say their final goodbyes, or things like that. So I think that it's a complex experience that isn't just one or the other. So I don't think, if you apply a fine enough grained analysis to what's going on, it's not the case that we have an unfalsifiable test here where no matter what happens, it fits. I mean, for example, in the case of the end-of-life experiences, we looked specifically at goodbyes, not just I want to be around people, but specifically at did the animals or humans, if you're looking at human ELEs, did they specifically do a goodbye thing? And they might wait until relatives arrive, but still want to be alone for the moment of their final pass-in. So I think we need to, I understand how it can look like, well, it sounds like you're saying something unfalsifiable here, but if you apply a finer grained analysis, I don't actually think that's the case.
Now, Stephen Cotter, 538 on YouTube writes, "My dog wasn't a digger. He never dug holes. The day before he died, he went out into the yard and dug a giant hole. The next day, he went out, laid down next to the hole, and died. He dug his own grave. We dug the hole a little deeper and buried him in it. He was an awesome dog, a big 90-pound mutt, very smart, handsome, and had a great personality. Rest in peace, Scar." Also, the next day, a song I'd never heard before came on the radio. It's called "Scars in Heaven." I didn't believe that animals went to heaven until Scar died. We heard the song, and then Jimmy's video on whether dogs go to heaven came out a couple days later.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a really impressive experience, and I'm glad my video on animal afterlife was helpful.
All right, and now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the JFK assassination and the testimony we've heard concerning it? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. You can check it out by going to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. While you're there, please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. We recently, finally, passed 100,000 subscribers, so now we're on our way to 200,000 subscribers, and I hope you'll join us.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going up to the Pacific Northwest to look at a strange incident that happened in Oakville, Washington. In 1994, a strange series of rainstorms happened, and instead of these storms simply raining water on the town, they dropped unusual gelatinous blobs. And as soon as the blobs fell, people started getting sick. So next week, we're going to be telling you the story of the mysterious Oakville blobs.
Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn on your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should hit the bell to get notifications. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/373. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.